Is Japan making fish in the Pacific Ocean radioactive? Well, no, not according to experts. But as the country has begun releasing treated radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean, there's been fear, skepticism, and even protest from citizens and Japan's neighbors, as well as outright bans on Japanese seafood from China. But why is Japan releasing treated radioactive water into the ocean? And how did the water get radioactive in the first place? Well, the full story combines record-breaking natural disasters that landed boats on top of houses, a poorly maintained, outdated power plant, and decades of nuclear energy history. One of the 25 largest nuclear reactors in the world, Fukushima's Daiichi power plant was built in 1971 on the eastern coast of Japan, looking out into the Pacific Ocean. 40 years later, in 2011, one of the most powerful recorded earthquakes in human history struck just around 40 miles away from Japan in the Pacific Ocean. Commonly referred to as the Great East Japan Earthquake, the 9.1 quake shook Japan, devastating buildings and infrastructure in its path. But that was just the start. As a result of the earthquake taking place in the ocean, a massive tsunami made its way to Japan's eastern coast. As it approached land, and specifically Fukushima's power plant right on the shoreline, the waves struck the nuclear reactor, breaching its sea barrier walls and flooding the buildings within. Although the workers at the power plant did their best to control the situation, the flooding resulted in multiple safety failures that eventually led to reactor explosions and nuclear meltdowns. The meltdown raised red flags about radiation that could affect the whole planet and stirred up troubling memories of the infamous 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl nuclear disasters that soured much of the public's perception of nuclear energy. Although the sea barrier wall was too low to protect the plant from the massive waves that caused the flooding, the disaster is considered mostly a man-made one. Initially blamed for the incident, the plant's executives were acquitted of negligence in 2019, but the disaster could have been prevented if more safety precautions had been implemented. Although the earthquake and tsunami resulted in an estimated death toll of around 19,500 people immediately following the event, the tsunami's destruction of the power plant posed more severe long-term issues for Japan, including the dangers of radioactive contamination for Japanese citizens. But there's specifically one issue that the country has only just begun correcting, and that's the radioactive water that had been contaminated and held at the plant since the disaster. Japan announced their plan in 2021 to treat and release the water into the Pacific, but now as they have begun the process, they've been met with protests over fears of potential contamination. China has banned seafood imports from the country, and many people across the globe fear the safety of Japanese seafood, especially those in the region. But Japan's government has repeatedly denied these safety issues. The Prime Minister even invited the press to record him eating fish from the ocean following the release of the water. And many in the scientific community agree the water is safe. In 2021, Nigel Marks, a nuclear materials scientist, admitted to Science that although the optics are terrible, releasing the water into the Pacific Ocean is the right thing to do. Similarly, in July of 2023, the International Atomic Energy Agency stated that Japan's plans for the water were consistent with international safety standards. Ultimately, Fukushima's nuclear disaster was a terrible combination of a catastrophic weather event meeting preventable human mistakes. However, this problem led to more discussion surrounding nuclear energy and how to implement it more safely.
Let me begin by saying that, again, I've said this before, I'd certainly say it again here today. Our thoughts and prayers go out to all the citizens of Japan, especially those families of the thousands of disaster victims and those that are going through a very, very difficult time. As this tragedy unfolds, I encourage the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other U.S. agencies to continue to coordinate with the Japanese government to provide any assistance that they need to recover. The events that struck Japan are reminders that we are all vulnerable to unexpected disasters, whether it's an act of nature or a terrorist attack. While we cannot predict when or where the next major disaster will occur, we know that it will occur, and we also know that adequate protection, adequate preparation, and response planning are vital to minimize both the injury and death when it does happen. Today's hearing is one of many I hope that this committee will have to make sure that our nation has prepared for the worst in order to prevent any lives lost from nuclear power in this country. In the United States, we have, as you know, 104 nuclear power plants in some 31 states, which generate approximately a fifth of our nation's total electric consumption. Nuclear power has helped to curb our reliance on dirty fossil fuels and reduce air pollution that damages our health and causes global warming. Over the years, the NRC has strived to create a culture of safety in the nuclear energy industry, and as long as I've been on this subcommittee, we've worked very hard to reinforce those efforts. As a result, we have not seen any direct deaths from nuclear power plant radiation exposure in this country in over 50 years. As part of this culture of safety, the NRC requires nuclear facilities to be designed to withstand natural disasters and terrorist attacks. After September 11th, the NRC took a closer look at the nuclear industry, put in place additional safety and security requirements. Despite all the protections that are in place, the crisis in Japan is a clear warning, clear reminder that we cannot become complacent when it comes to nuclear safety. I often say, as my colleagues are tired of hearing me say, if it isn't perfect, make it better. And that certainly applies to nuclear plants and the way that they're operating and with respect to their safety. And that's why Chairman Boxer and I asked the NRC for a comprehensive review of our nuclear fleet. We want to make sure that every precaution is being taken to safeguard the American people from a similar nuclear accident. The NRC is just getting started on this review, and I anxiously await their results. Today, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses an update on Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant and update on our response to that crisis. I also look forward to hearing what we can learn from the ongoing crisis in order to prevent similar events from occurring right here. I'm particularly interested in hearing about the state of emergency planning process from the Delaware Department of Safety and Homeland Security. Secretary Shalero, we welcome him especially. And as chairman of the Subcommittee on Nuclear Safety, I take seriously my responsibilities, our responsibilities, to make certain that we are taking the appropriate measures to make the nuclear industry as safe as they can possibly be. And as I've said before, while I'm a proponent of clean energy, my top priority of our domestic power and nuclear power industry remains public safety.
Mr. Lyman, the NRC has obviously concluded that a 10-mile emergency planning zone isn't large enough to deal with the Japanese meltdown. Do you think the emergency zone in the United States is large enough at 10 miles?
No, Congressman Markey, I do not. I believe that U.S. plants are vulnerable to the type of event we've seen in Fukushima, and that event has demonstrated there could be significant radiological exposures far beyond 10 miles.
Yeah. You know, after Chernobyl, everyone, and I was the chair of the committee, the energy subcommittee that had a hearing right after Chernobyl, and everyone said, well, you know, that's a bad design at Chernobyl and a repressive political regime, and it couldn't happen here. That was that hearing. At this hearing, however, it's more difficult because Japan is our technological equal. You know, we import all of our electronic equipment from Japan that we buy on a daily basis. So it's obvious that we can learn a lot of lessons, if we're willing to, from Japan and be a little more modest about mankind's ability to control nature, to control unpredicted events technologically. Let me move on. In terms of the spent fuel, which has been one of the main sources of radiation at the Japanese nuclear reactors. In 2008, Chairman Yaskow said that he believed that, quote, the most clear-cut example of an area where additional safety margins can be gained involves additional efforts to move spent nuclear fuel from pools to dry cask storage. Dr. Lyman, do you agree that the chances of a spent fuel fire and radiation release would be lower if spent fuel was moved out of the giant swimming pools and into dry cask storage as soon as possible?
Yes, I do believe that you would get a lower risk if you remove some of the fuel from the pools, reducing the density and reducing the heat load, and also improving the potential for circulation between assemblies.
So some people might say that the likelihood of anything bad happening is so small that there really isn't any difference between having them in the swimming pools or moving them into dry cask. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say what happened in Fukushima shows us that we do not really understand the fundamental likelihood of a variety of accidents. It's apparent that there was already a challenge to one of the spent fuel pools that was probably not predicted. It surprised a lot of people, and so I would say there's going to have to be a reevaluation of what we do know and what we don't know.
The meltdown in Japan was caused by an electricity outage that was itself triggered by the earthquake and tsunami, but most nuclear reactors here are only required to have 7 days' worth of diesel fuel for their emergency generators and only 4 to 8 hours' worth of battery capacity in the event of their diesel generators failing. In Japan, the reactors had 8 hours' worth of battery generation capacity. Don't you agree that the NRC's regulation should be changed to require more diesel fuel and greater battery capacity in order to give emergency responders more time to be able to figure out the physics and the electronics of the mess that they could be confronted with because of some natural disaster?
Yes, I do agree that there needs to be a reexamination of the assumptions about the ability to rescue a plant in need in the event of a significant natural disaster or terrorist attack that could have damage to the surrounding infrastructure. I think the assumptions for a coping capability at plants are based on overly optimistic assumptions about the arrival of the cavalry.
Yeah, I thank you, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.